is. So part of it is for me to hear that as well, because people say, well, wouldn't you like to stay in New Bern? And I go, duh. But what I've learned to do is every time I go across the bridge and I look at the water and everything, I don't look at it as, oh, gee, Lord, I really want to stay here. It's just so wonderful. You hear the emotion? It's, Lord, you have blessed me with my time here. What a gift. Thank you. And my whole demeanor changes. And it's just not the gift of the water and the boats, but it's the gift of everything. Right? So it goes hand in hand. So how do I take and how have I learned to do any of this in real time? And this to me was the real gift from God in all of this. Let's see if I can make this picture bigger. This is an actual piece of yellow paper from April 2010 on one of these yellow pads. I didn't recognize its significance at the time, but I was at a meeting of our Stewardship Commission in the Diocese of West Virginia, and we had an opening reflection that just stimulated a big thought in my brain. Now, typically, the way I would have operated in the past would have been, yeah, I've got this great thought, and they're all going to need to hear it, because just like flipping the lights around, you know, they're just going to be so bowled over by this great thought, everybody's going to be happy. I just got to make sure they know it right away. Well, if you're not ready to hear something, no matter how good it is, can you hear it? No, you think about that as part of the spiritual life. When people can be in the prayer book over and over again, and all of a sudden a prayer that we say every week jumps out at them, you know, and it touches you anew because now you were ready to hear it. So here's what was happening. They said something, and I heard this phrase, the transactional analysis of money. Now, if you know anything about transactional analysis, typically what happens in transactional analysis, you work out of your parent, adult, or your child when you respond to something, and you may respond back to somebody out of parent, adult, or child. And what is bad is when the child is being told by the parent to do things, and we're probably better off when it's adult to adult. And you can look at that as how we interact a lot in church, because there's an awful lot of people at times who get childish over things, and they expect father to come in and fix it. You know, whose faith journey is it? You know, things along those particular lines. So getting into the adult. So I wrote that down, and I began to see that this would be a great idea to bring forward for a big training we were doing for the whole diocese. But I wrote it down on the paper, and I then waited and asked permission at an appropriate point in the meeting to bring it in. And I brought it in to the meeting, and it was accepted, and we deepened it and made it bigger and better. Why? I was not anxious to get it into the meeting. I knew it was good, and somehow I was given the grace just to wait a while. So that's the first piece. And then over time, I began to realize what this truly represented. What I call the YPD. You give it an acronym, it has real deep meaning. This is the yellow pad discipline. Okay. The other one was the ARC, the anxiety reflection chart. Okay. All wrapped into the R, small I, AS, reflection action. I can't remember the name of that. All right, I'll come back to that. That's the synthesis, my reflection synthesis, in action, my reflection in action synthesis. So that's the other thing that came out that I learned I had done in my thesis that I didn't know I'd done until after I'd done my thesis, when somebody smarter than me pointed it out to me. So I was really grateful for that. Anyway, the yellow pad discipline. What I began to understand about this was, when I go into a meeting, all right, I can have a certain demeanor in the meeting. And so what this keeps me focused on is I'm trying to listen carefully. And so something will come, somebody might say something in the meeting that really stimulates a thought. And what I've learned to do is write the thought down. And then the next part of the discipline was to then wait to see if somebody else brought the thought into the meeting. And if it was brought into the meeting, I would then say, well, that's great. I'm really smart. I thought of that too. Check mark. And it would be the collaborative group process I would be embracing. But if my thought was not brought into the meeting, I then had to think about, first off, was the meeting ready to hear the thought? Was it appropriate for the time? And then I would make the decision whether or not to bring it into the meeting. So an example of that would be, this is at our diocesan convention in the Diocese of West Virginia in 2012. And we were having a real issue over how much each of the parishes contribute and clergy salaries, and somebody wanted to redo the budget, and it was a whole lot of hoo-ha. And I'd spoken appropriately at a pre-planning committee meeting from my perspective on it, and I wasn't quite sure it was going to go. And if you've ever been a delegate to a diocesan convention, you know there are some people who are mic happy. They just can't wait to get to a mic. I wonder if at one time in my life if I was viewed as mic happy. So anyway, I'm sitting there and I'm watching the flow of the thing go, and I'm making notes, and I'm framing what I might say. And then as I listen to the meeting, I realize there is absolutely no reason for me to get up because it's going to take care of itself, which it did, with minimal angst. So that to me was an example that got me to get to the next part. So I waited to see if it needed to come into the meeting. So you can see I'm in a form of the balcony. I'm watching the patterns. I'm listening carefully, but I'm in real time. Real time. So the next part that comes out of this is if I decide to bring it into the meeting, this is not in my thesis, this is my most recent understanding of this. I was at a conference about a month ago, and I was sitting at a table with other very senior people. This is the Consortium of Endowed Episcopal Parishes, and we were engaged in chatting. I was with rectors and deans, people who know their stuff. It was really great fun, and I started with my yellow pad, taking notes, keeping track, and then it was to do a little project. Would somebody be the secretary at the table? Well, I've learned to always be the secretary because it keeps me out of trouble. And I'm not bad at taking notes in real time. So as I'm listening to the meeting and I'm charting what everybody is saying and occasionally throwing my own thoughts in, what I wound up doing was, and maybe I can eventually zoom in on this, but I wound up pulling out of each of the thoughts a one-word statement that summed up what their thoughts were, and it just sort of happened through the whole thing. And then when I got up to be the one who reported out for our group, there were like 7 or 8 different groups reporting out, and much like I talked about at diocesan convention, there are mic happy people. Isn't it scary when you give a person like me, a priest, a microphone? It's like, at what point are we going to get it back? So we had people who spoke beautifully, but a lot. I got up there and I said, this is what our group did, and I basically read the words, maybe 1 or 2 small pieces, and I was done very quickly, and I sat down. And one of the folks at my table said to me, have you studied Gestalt? I'm still trying to figure out if that was a compliment or not. But he looked like he was happy, so I think it was a good thing. But I knew I had been able to be succinct in getting my thought into the meeting. And so the yellow pad discipline for me has been a matter of taking a very active mind, but focusing and listening carefully, hearing the patterns. So in modeling this in a vestry meeting, for instance, my role as the rector is, I'm the chair of the vestry meeting. The rector is the president of the vestry. But what I'll do is I will convene the meeting and then get us into prayer so we remember who we are, although the lay folks can do that as well. And then turn it over to the senior leader, the senior warden, and then sit back and listen with my yellow pad and engage the meeting with clarifying questions or other thoughts, or occasionally appropriate humor, or sometimes people might say inappropriate humor. That's a judgment call. And work it in such a way that we find the common ground that we're looking for. and to keep balanced and to keep listening. Yes, Dave?
Well, I'm hearing you use the language in, thoughts, ideas.
Yes, sir.
What I haven't heard is emotions.
Mhm.
Tracking when you're getting angry
Okay,
or frustrated during a meeting.
okay. I have found that by channeling through my hand and doing something that takes energy, if I'm totally in my head, I can let it process, but it sort of like flows out through the pen. And so by putting it here, I do a thing a lot where I'll do a column on the side where I'll do additional thoughts, where they're more self-reflective. I may be charting the meeting and then I'll write me, and this is what I feel in the moment, or something like that. So there's a little bit of a reflective piece on that. It's being aware of who I am and where I am in the moment. Remember, the overarching control of this, I get the strength to do this out of my emotional connection to it. Jesus is very emotional on the way to the cross. I think that's the only way he could keep walking. But he was also committed, all right, to doing what he was going to do. He knew that was his commitment. When he put his face to Jerusalem, that was his commitment. You know, in the Garden of Gethsemane, he really makes it clear, okay, I am going to do this. And he goes and does it. Remember, he is conscious of his choice all along. If Jesus is nothing more than a marionette, then there is no sacrifice. There's no salvation. It makes no sense. So there's got to be a balance between the emotion and the intellect.
He would stick to it in obedience, but overrode his emotions.
To one who is obedient is one who listens fully to God. And so, yes, it's not so much he overrode his emotions. I believe what he did was he allowed his emotions to help him live fully into the total promise that we all have, but he is the perfect example of his total obedience to go to the cross. So it's not like, I'm so smart I can override my emotions. The other part of the trick here in the last minute I have before we break and get ready to go. Remember, I've been talking about tools to overcome or to at least handle akidia, to handle the fact that this is hard work, is to remember one other thing, and the notion of being in your head would have easily described me early in my ministry. And then working with a spiritual director, I began to understand that, frankly, I am truly propelled by my heart, but by my upbringing, I did a lot to hold tight, okay? And the trick is to know when I'm in my head or in my heart or moving back and forth. And if we want to speak to Jesus, he was obviously the perfect example of one who always knew where he was, so he could be there for us.